What do you think of when you come across old photographs from the early 20th century? Probably about who the people in those pictures were, what they were doing, what kind of life they lived. For us personally, slightly yellowed photos of the past years are a whole separate universe, with mysteries of the past that we can hardly solve. We are always curious to look at the characters depicted in old photos and think about, why do they look so strange? No, seriously, take a closer look. Almost all people in portraits from the early part of the last century look like porcelain dolls staring intently into the lens. By now, you're probably thinking of post-mortem photos when family members commission group portraits with their deceased relatives to at least capture family unity for the archives. But no, that's a completely different story. People in historical photos often look unnatural for completely different reasons, which we'll tell you about next. Public photo studios began to appear in the late 19th century, and initially they didn't look too solid. Most often photographers set up photo studios in their own apartments for the sake of economy, of course, or rented tiny rooms in profitable houses for this purpose, which for obvious reasons caused a lot of inconvenience. However, the main inconvenience was another. In those days, electricity was not yet used for lighting, and photographers had to work only during the day and only in good clear weather, when natural light was enough for photography, and excessively bright light was regulated by means of curtains. Of course, in time the situation with lighting was solved, and photo studios became decent establishments where you could order a photo for any taste. Individual and group studio portraits, wedding, and even boudoir, erotic shots. Later, when the photography industry began to gain momentum, photographers were able to organize roadshows. This was usually long, expensive, and quite difficult technically, but not impossible. Photographers took pictures in the interiors of their customers, as well as traveled to a variety of objects that needed to be recorded for history. Actually, it is not necessary to say once again that the popularity of photography in the early 20th century was simply overwhelming, and people were ready to spend several hours in front of the lens, so that as a result to get the cherished photo. For these purposes, by the way, photographers had a special neck rest. It was used when a person simply could not physically bear to sit or stand in one pose, as well as during the shooting post-mortem to fix the neck of the deceased. By the way, it was because of the need to look into the lens for a long time for one single photo that the phrase "watch the birdie" appeared. It was used by photographers when working on children's portraits. Obviously, it is not an easy task to convince a child to sit still for a long time, look into the lens, and if possible, not to blink. That's why the photographers emphasize to the children that a bird is about to fly out of the lens, and to see it you have to look very carefully. Besides, you must not move, otherwise the bird will get scared and will not fly out. And sometimes they put the bird over the apparatus, fed it water through a special tube, and it sang, forcing the mesmerized children to sit still. And you know, it worked. The children sat still and patiently waited for the bird to appear. Unfortunately, such tricks rarely worked with adult clients of the photo studio, and many simply could not stand posing in front of the camera for hours, and at the most crucial moment they blinked. As a result, on the pictures they turned out with closed eyes. And what to do in such a situation? With reshooting was too much trouble, and the photographer was not sure that the client will not blink again. By the way to avoid defective work was found soon enough, and this way was retouching. At first it was very simple, using pencil or gouache, but it allowed, for example, to draw open eyes on the finished photo. Of course, at first the retouching was noticeable, because the added elements were clearer than other details in the photo, but in time this technology was perfected. Actually, the long posing in front of the lens and the appearance of retouching are the two main reasons why people's faces in old photos look somewhat detached and unnatural. In the first case, the expression of the face in the photo directly depended on the social status of the customer, because a nobleman of a noble family with proper education could stand still for a very long time, maintaining a secular expression. As a result, in the photo he, more often than not, turned out tense and sometimes even angry. People who were simpler, at some point tired of posing, did not notice how they relaxed their face, and their look became aloof and somehow confused. and the result was corresponding. In addition, we should not forget that Moors in the early 20th century were completely different than they are now, and even a slight smile could be regarded as a total disrespect and even an insult. Not to mention women's portraits, where a smile on any representative of the fair sex could mean only one thing: the girl is very frivolous. And since in the photo studio usually made just the ceremonial portraits, they were equated to the parade exit, and they had to look decent. In the second case, people's faces, and not only faces, in photographs looked strange because of retouching. The fact is that the predecessors of photographers, artists, when making portraits with pencil or ink, often corrected the external flaws of their customers. For example, they did not reflect wrinkles and skin imperfections, enlarged or reduced. The eyes removed the hump on the nose. In general, they adjusted the portrait to the existing standards of beauty at that time, so the client received a really beautiful work. When public photo studios appeared, their first clients were, to put it mildly, in cultural shock, having received such a realistic picture, which displayed all those nuances carefully hidden by the artists. It sometimes came to scandals and fights, as people could not believe that the picture was what they really looked like. By the way, not only the face was retouched. At the beginning of the 20th century, it was a very common practice to edit a bit the groin area on the photos of famous strongmen, who usually performed in tight tights, making it smooth like Ken, the fiancé of Barbie doll. This was done because of the strict mores of the time, and if during the live performance with protruding genitals could not do anything, then in photos they were successfully retouched, and so that no one would not think that there was anything under the tights. And one more point, why people in photos of the beginning of the last century did not look too natural. All because of the existing norms of decency, which did not allow to publicly show their feelings even to spouses and close relatives. And since the portrait made in the atelier equated to the grand exit, it was necessary to look at it accordingly. That is why people could show their attitude to each other through unobtrusive gestures. For example, one of the spouses could put his hand on the shoulder of his partner, and members of the same family could choose the same items of toiletry, and thus emphasize their kinship. In family portraits of spouses, the woman usually sat on a chair and the man stood next to her, indicating mutual respect in the relationship. In group shots, the parents or older relatives usually sat in the center of the frame, and everyone else took a seat next to or behind them, depending on the degree of kinship. Thank you so much for liking this video. Be sure to subscribe to our channel